When Theodore Roosevelt left office, he was basically strong enough and powerful enough within the Republican Party that he could pretty much name his successor for the Republican nominee for the next presidential election. And the person he wanted to follow him was William Howard Taft. And Taft actually will receive the Republican nomination for president, and he will win the presidency. Now, Taft had a difficult time as president, primarily because he never really wanted to be president. This was something that his wife wanted for him. What he dreamed of doing was serving on the Supreme Court. And in time, he's actually going to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Taft will be the only person to serve as president and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in our history. But part of the other reason why Taft had a difficult time was quite simply because he was not Theodore Roosevelt. It would have been difficult for anyone to follow Roosevelt as president. And Taft had some of his own ideas. He wanted to do things a little differently. And a lot of the real adamant supporters of Roosevelt, some of whom were still in government positions, really pushed back against him wanting to change any of the things that Roosevelt had started. And so for him, it's going to be a hard time as president. Word will be sent out to Theodore that Taft is trying to change things, that he's not following through on some of the things Roosevelt had done, and he will become a real disappointment for Roosevelt, and there will be a real strain in their friendship after this time period. So towards the end of this first term, when it became time to really look at the next election, Roosevelt had come back. He had been gone to Africa, and he came back, and he decided that he had really made a mistake by stepping down when he did from the presidency, and so he decided that he was going to run for president again. And so he pushed to get the Republican nomination. The Republican Party, however, had kind of moved away from Roosevelt. Now, he still had his great supporters, and there are going to be those who really want him to have the nomination, but the majority thought that they should really stick with the incumbent, which was William Howard Taft. And so the Republican Party will go with Taft. The Democratic Party is going to go with a man named Woodrow Wilson. And the Progressive Party will reach out to Roosevelt, and they will name him as their candidate. And during one of his speeches, he kind of beat his hands and fists against his chest and said, I am as fit as a bull moose to run for president. And kind of by association, that became the nickname for the Progressive Party. And so it really was known as the Bull Moose Party. But technically, it's the Progressive Party. So what Roosevelt does without really meaning to is he splits the votes for the Republican Party, because there were those who supported Taft, but there were also members of the Republican Party that were still loyal to Roosevelt. There just wasn't enough of them with the progressive votes for him to actually win the presidency, but it was just enough that they split the support for Taft, and so he came in with fewer votes than what Wilson did. And so Wilson wins the presidential election of 1912. Now, Wilson was a reformer. He had been governor of New Jersey. He'd been a college president, had a PhD in history, was a very good speaker, a good writer, and had his own way of doing things, but his strength lay in domestic issues. And he said it would really be a mistake if most of his term in office was spent having to deal with foreign problems. Unfortunately for him, World War I is going to break out after he becomes president, and he's also going to have some issues with Mexico. So foreign issues are going to really dominate his time in office. But right from the very beginning, Wilson, when he was inaugurated, he called Congress into special session and gave a speech to them in person. And by doing that, he returned to an old tradition. George Washington and John Adams, our first two presidents, had done the same thing. They had started giving speeches in person. But Thomas Jefferson, our third president, while an excellent writer, was not good in person. He did not like to give speeches, and so he would write out his messages, hand them off to a messenger, and have the messenger go and present them to Congress. So every president after Jefferson did the same thing. Wilson, who, as I said, had been a college professor and liked to speak, decided that he was going to go back to that original tradition and give his messages in person himself. And so from Wilson's time on, now every president does the same thing. One of the primary things that Wilson did domestically was to get the Federal Reserve Act passed. This was the first time that they had really looked at and revamped the banking system in this country in decades. It is going to create regional Federal Reserve banks located in major cities, each with its own 9-member board of directors. Private U.S. member banks were required to subscribe the amounts of non-transferable stock into their regional Federal Reserve Bank. And the idea was that, say for instance, Sherman, a bank in Sherman, started to struggle. Before this time period, they would have to reach out to Washington to get funds to try to help them keep from going under. And a lot of times they weren't able to get the funds there in time to stop that from happening. When a bank goes under, then that means it can't give out loans to businessmen or to farmers or to people trying to buy homes. And so then people start having to quit their jobs, or because there aren't any jobs, they're not able to pay their bills. And so a lot of times you would have a depression that would start as a result of that. By this Federal Reserve Act being created, then the idea is that you would have a bank, say, in Dallas, so that now if a bank in Sherman starts to struggle, it can reach out to Dallas for help and obviously get funds a lot quicker than what it could have from Washington, and hopefully would keep that bank from going under. So this is going to be a very popular act, and it's going to really revolutionize the banking system. And then we have the foreign problems, which are going to dominate Wilson's administration. The Mexican Revolution began in 1910 and succeeded in overthrowing the corrupt government of a man named Diaz in favor of Francisco Madero. Most people at that time assumed the new idealistic president Madero would lead Mexico into a new era of true democracy. That, unfortunately, was not to be. A general named Huerta had crushed a counter-revolution against Madero, and then had realized that he controlled the majority of military power in Mexico. So he decided that he wanted to be dictator and succeeded in assassinating Madero. After Madero's murder, Huerta proclaimed himself as provisional president. A man named Carranza gathered a force against Huerta. Now, up until this time, whenever you would have a government that would take over in a country, the United States would automatically recognize it, make it very official. And when one country recognizes another, that means that they will have a trading relationship, they will send ambassadors, there will be diplomatic connections, and so recognition is very important, particularly to a newly established government. And this had been done automatically. Wilson is going to come in with a different idea and a different view, and he's going to say that if a government comes to power in an immoral fashion, in other words, by assassination or murder, if it doesn't appear in his mind to be legal, then the United States would not necessarily automatically recognize it. We might withhold recognition. So this is going to be something new that Wilson establishes. So you have forces under Carranza that are trying to grow strong enough where they can challenge Huerta. Wilson is going to be a supporter of Carranza. In April of 1914, a small group of American sailors were arrested in Tampico in Mexico. Mexico promptly released the captives and apologized, but they refused the American admiral's demand for a salute of 21 guns. Wilson asked Congress for authority to use force against Mexico. And before Congress could act, Wilson ordered the Navy to seize the Mexican port of Veracruz. Wilson was rescued by an offer of mediation from what came to be known as the ABC powers, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. They decided that basically the United States should withdraw its troops, but that the Huerta government should collapse, should go away. And without a lot of support at that point, Huerta had to give up his government, give up his authority. This happens in July of 1914, and Carranza takes over. In January 1916, a group of Pancho Villa's men attacked a train on the Mexico Northwestern Railway near Santa Isabel and killed 18 American employees. Villa and had kind of come to prominence during this time period because things were in such a flux and kind of chaotic with the different governments taking over, and so he and his rebel forces were also trying to get enough strength and enough support that they might be able to take over government in Mexico. On March 9th, 1916, he ordered 1,500 Mexican raiders to make a cross-border attack against Columbus, New Mexico, in response to the U.S. government's official recognition of the Carranza regime and for the loss of lives in battle due to defective bullets purchased from the United States. They attacked a detachment of the 13th U.S. Cavalry, seized 100 horses and mules, burned the town, killed 10 soldiers and 8 civilian residents, and took a great deal of ammunition and weapons. Wilson responded to this raid by sending 6,000 troops under General John J. Pershing to Mexico to pursue Villa. Wilson also dispatched several divisions of Army and National Guard troops to protect the southern U.S. border against further raids and counterattacks. During the surge, the U.S. launched its first air combat mission with 8 airplanes, and the U.S. expedition was eventually called off after failing to find Villa. In 1923, he was assassinated by some of his own men. And of course, the next thing that's going to really happen is you're going to have the outbreak of World War I, and that's what we'll talk about in this next lecture.